a very dear friend and an esteemed colleague, Dr. Sharon Paul, in this session tonight. She may not do so, but I'm going to hold up my copy of her book. And when I see her in Oregon, I'm going to have her sign it, Art and Science in the Choral Rehearsal. It's a must-have book for almost everybody. I think that I'm using it currently with my graduate conducting students, but I think that you will find so many helpful insights and wonderful ideas for almost every level that you may be teaching or engaging with in terms of your choir. Sharon Paul, art from University of Oregon, Music and Dance, and where she serves as Director of Choral Activities and Chair of Vocal and Choral Studies. And I am a proud alumnus of the University of Oregon School of Music, and so it's with great pride that I welcome Sharon, Dr. Sharon Paul to our Zoom forum. And I think you can unmute and give her a welcome. You all to go up to the upper right-hand corner under View and turn on Speaker. Click Speaker so that then we will see Sharon Paul prominently as she shares her screen and her presentation. Sharon.
Great. Thank you so much, Kathy. Thank you for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. And I'm going to share my screen a lot. Then sometimes I'll come out of sharing my screen, ask you a few questions. So I hope this will be interactive as we go. Early in my career, I wondered whether I could make my rehearsals more productive and more engaging if I better understood how the brain learned, how it learned information, recalled, and retained information. And so that's really how the book came about. I started 30-some years ago wondering about all of this. And now finally have produced a book after working with it for a long time. So I'm going to share my screen so you can see some slides. I always tease my students now we always talk as we push buttons. Like if we are saying, I'm going to share my screen, which is sort of akin to, I'm now raising my pen in class because I'm going to write a note to myself. So here we are. Certainly it appears that attention spans have been growing shorter and shorter. They say now that some studies show that the average attention span for a human is around 8 seconds. And that's the amount of time that an average human is able to maintain one thought without distraction. And you'll be delighted to know that scientists think goldfish have a 9-second attention span. Now, this may not be the most legitimate scientific comparison, to tell you the truth, but I love the image of it. And I actually did some reading recently about it and discovered that fish scientists were deeply offended by this article that said this about attention spans because they felt that the goldfish were not given their due, that goldfish actually can do much better than that. But anecdotally, we all know that there are huge distractions for our students. And so we really need strategies to keep our students engaged in their learning. And that's really what all of this is about. So I will start out by saying I am not a scientist. I have not done double-blind studies on everything we're going to talk about, but I've read lots and lots of scientific studies. And I've based all of my work on scientific studies that have been easily replicated, which of course is one of the hallmarks of good science. When something has been hard to replicate, as in a couple of the social psychology studies that I'll tell you about, I will always tell you when things have been hard to replicate. And this is important because there are a lot of myths roaming around, a lot of neuromyths, a lot of techniques marketed to teachers that are quick fixes, theoretically. And so I think it's really important to base everything that we do on science. And so that's what we're going to be doing today. I'm going to share a lot of strategies with you, and I hope you'll find these interesting to you, and some of them will be things you've probably done for a long time already, and maybe it'll be interesting why they work so well in terms of learning. And I'm hoping to spark a little bit of new thinking as well. So we're gonna start. I'll just tell you a little bit about what I'm gonna highlight. Most of this is in the book, some is not in the book, some is new information. We're going to talk a little bit about how to embed problem solving into rehearsal and why that's so important. I'll give you 3 strategies for how to do that. We're going to talk about what I call accountability, engagement, and agency versus social loafing. You're probably familiar with the term social loafing, and we'll talk about why it's easy to socially loaf, unfortunately, in an ensemble and how to avoid that. We'll talk about the Ringelmann effect, which I'll explain, the use of emotion in rehearsal, priming, which I'll explain, and learned helplessness. Then we'll talk about using multiple entry points for information as you teach. We'll talk about using writing in rehearsal, which may seem a little unusual, but it's a fantastic way for learning. And finally, it's my tradition always, whenever I speak, to end by talking about joy and the joy that we have in music making. So we will end there. Please feel free to ask questions at any time. People could type in the chat, and maybe somebody could monitor the chat and let me know if I should stop at any point and talk about something a little more in detail. So I'm going to start with problem solving, our first topic, and I'm going to take you to the Serengeti. And I'm going to imagine, please, that you are an early human and you are foraging for food. And you come across trees with colorful fruit on them, and you have to figure out which fruit is poisonous and which fruit is edible. And how important do you suppose it would be to remember that information once you solved the problem, right? The key is, in order for us to survive, our brains developed into dynamic problem-solving mechanisms. We are innately curious and questioning, and anyone that has spent time with young children will know they just want to know about absolutely everything. So once we solved the problem, it was imperative to our survival that we accurately remember that information. And while this may seem really far removed from a choral rehearsal, our brain wiring is still very much connected to our world as early humans. And so we know that our brains derive pleasure from solving problems. And this is a survival technique. We have to be able to solve problems, remember. So there's a little bit of a neurotransmitter that gives us rather a pleasurable sensation. So we also know that information acquired through problem-solving efforts is more likely to be remembered. So this is really key to us. So because our time is short together, I'm not going to explain the science behind that. I do talk a little bit about brain science at that point in the book. But what we're going to talk about instead is embedding problem solving throughout our rehearsal process. And this is key to helping our students remember. So rather than providing answers, if we can give them the tools so students can find the solutions themselves, they're going to be much more likely to remember the information. The person solving the problem is making the neural connections, right? And the neural connections are what learning is. And so this is really key. If you supply the answers to your singers or your students in whatever capacity you're working with your students, they may not really be learning. And so one example of that is if you're singing a fugue and you say, sopranos, you're in the foreground here, and tenors, you're kind of background, but then over here, basses bring it to the foreground. So you're making all sorts of connections in your brain, but they may not necessarily. So if you can help them problem solve all of that, they're much more likely to remember. And while this may sound time consuming, this can be done in very, very quickly. One of my favorite books about the pedagogy of teaching is called Small Teaching by a man named James Lang. And in Small Teaching, he shows how you don't need to throw out your entire syllabus as you learn new ways to think about teaching. You could change 1 or 2 things about your syllabus, and it can be extremely impactful. It's hard to use that word. Oxford would not allow me to use the word impactful in the book. I had to use the word powerful. I'm not sure why, but they hated the word impactful. Anyway, you could make very small changes and it'll be very powerful. There's another book by a protege of James Lang who has the beautifully colorful name Flower Darby. I love her name. And she wrote a book called Small Teaching Online, which talks also about how to teach effectively online by just making small changes to the way that you teach. So here are some examples of problem solving. There's our Sherlock, I couldn't resist. The problems must be easy enough to solve, but difficult enough to take some mental effort. And we're going to look at 3 ways to create opportunities for students to problem solve. So each time you present a problem to solve, they are engaging, their neurons are firing. So here's the first strategy. Start rehearsal with a problem to solve, and here are some examples of how you could do that. Even from the first moment of taking out a piece, please take out the piece where fire is used as a metaphor for passion, right? So they're immediately thinking, you're not providing them the answer, they're pondering. Please take out the piece by the Baroque composer. So you can change these for whatever level you're working with or whatever would be appropriate in your circumstance. We will now work on the piece that begins in D major. This is one of my favorites. We are starting our rehearsal at the climactic moment in the piece. I love that because if they've practiced, they have an opinion about where the climactic moment is. If you catch them at a time when they haven't gotten their practice in, they will be turning pages very quickly to figure it out. We will begin in the C major section. So again, having them do a little bit of analysis as they go. You can adapt these for any level. I had an elementary school teacher who contacted me saying that she uses this with her kids now and they love the game, and that she has the students lead it sometimes in how they can figure out how to get people to first take their music out. So instead of being passive and receiving information like, okay, take out the Bach piece, we are starting them out with a problem to solve. We remember what we think about, and I'll come back to this a couple of times. This is how we learn. We remember what we think about. You could also write these questions on the board. For example, be prepared to solfege a C minor scale. So when they come into rehearsal in the after times when we are all in the same room having rehearsal, they can say, be prepared to solfege a C minor scale, or be sure you know the translation of the French song. And then the best thing for learning is if they could turn to a neighbor and have a little task-centered discussion right then about, do you remember how we solfege C minor, or did you study the French song? Let's talk about the translation. Task-centered discussions are really good for learning. We spend a lot of time teaching our choirs not to talk to each other, understandably, but if we can get them to do these little task-centered discussions, it can actually be extremely useful. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing and ask if any of you in your teaching situation can think of an example, such as, how you might get people started in rehearsal by asking a question instead of starting with an instruction. Just feel like you could shout out, unmute yourself and shout out an example.
You might have a rhythm pattern from one of the pieces you're doing, or a melodic pattern from one of the pieces you're doing on the board, and let them find the piece that matches.
That's fantastic. Yeah, we've done that with solfege actually. We'll put something in solfege up and have them figure out what that melody is. Thanks, Angie. That's great. Yeah. Anybody else? We're going to talk about wait time in a minute, of how long you should wait after you ask a question for somebody to be brave enough to answer the question. Anybody else? One more example.
I have to unmute myself. I love the idea of the small conversations. We kind of call that think, pair, share. And I've used it in my academics, but I don't use it in choir. And so my brain is just buzzing right now. That's a great, I love that.
Thank you. Yeah. It's a great technique in choir. And the only challenge is then getting them to stop talking, once you've started the think, pair, share. But in terms of learning, it actually is so good for them because they're rehearsing information as they're talking. So it's actually great. Okay, thank you for the brave souls that shared there. I'm going to go back to sharing my screen and hope that my keynote comes back to where it's supposed to be. All right, hang on. Okay, now let's see. There it is. I am still so afraid of Zoom, which is silly because now I'm teaching over Zoom every day, but it still frightens me. Okay, you now do see my screen, I hope. Okay, so our second strategy in problem solving is self-monitoring. And I'll give you 3 quick examples of that. One is you can provide tools for your singers to make autonomous decisions during rehearsal. And any of you that have ever heard Judy Bowers speak, she speaks eloquently on the rules of transfer. She created the system, I think, when she was teaching middle school, and it's a great way to give students basic rules that they need to apply every time they see a certain situation. So it keeps them very actively engaged. Here's some examples of what you might want. You could say, place a slight lift when you see a comma in the text. And then every time you get to a comma, you don't need to explain it. They will just do it. And you only need to give the exception if that is one of the values that you want. Never breathe after a word ending in S. I usually say it, never breathe after a word ending in S unless given permission. And here's another, any note value longer than the pulse of the piece must grow or decay. And so, so this gives you the opportunity to say, you apply these rules. You know, you give them whatever number of rules. Every time you come to this situation, you apply the rule. And it's a great way to keep them engaged. Studies show that musicians report an increase in motivation, enjoyment, and engagement when encouraged to make thoughtful choices about their own performance in an ensemble. This is really important. There was actually a study also that showed the audience could tell the difference when musicians were able to make some autonomous decisions. Now, there are certain decisions we don't want them to make autonomously. Obviously, you know, there are certain, you know, place the cutoff wherever you want is not the way that we're going to go. But if we can give them some rules that they can apply, then it's a great way to self-monitor and keep them engaged and also to learn. Another one that I used when I was with the San Francisco Girls Chorus the first time I was there. So the first time I was with the Girls Chorus, I was in grad school at Stanford and I worked with their 8 to 10-year-olds. And as you can, anybody that's worked with kids knows, they love to ask questions. And once one asks a question, then you need to be fair and let everyone ask their questions. And so one day it was just driving me absolutely crazy. So I said to them, I'm going to teach you a new word today. And the word is relevant. And I explained what relevant meant. And I said, if your question is not relevant to this moment in rehearsal, would you please write down your question and come tell me afterwards? And I'd be happy to answer it. This was amazing because they loved the idea that they could self-monitor. You could see a hand start to go up and then go down. And they loved at the break or after rehearsal to tell me, Sharon, 3 times today, I almost asked a question, but then I realized it wasn't relevant to that moment. So I've written it down here and it was great. So that's another example of self-monitoring, and that it completely saved my life in terms of pacing back then. And the third strategy for self-monitoring, which I'm sure a lot of you use, is I have my singers raise their hands in rehearsal when they make a mistake. And this, again, is a great self-monitoring, gives them a little bit of dopamine when they say, oh, I acknowledge I made a mistake there. Helps me know if we read through something and I hear a mistake but don't see any hands up, I know I need to go back. If I see a hand go up, I know that they'll self-correct after that. And so this is another form of self-monitoring, which I think works extremely well. And then our third strategy of problem solving is Socratic teaching, which, as you know, involves asking questions. Asking questions creates another opportunity for problem solving. Apparently, Socrates knew a great deal about brain science. And so the question is, after you ask a question, like I had just done with you, how long should you wait for an answer? Hold up your fingers. Tell me how many seconds. What are your opinions? I'm seeing 10, 3 to 5. I'm scrolling through. 5, 5, 7. There's a nice compromise. 5. Great. Okay. Great. Let me ask you a different question. How long do you think teachers wait after they ask a question before they call on someone or supply the answer themselves? I'm seeing a 3, a 4, a 2, a 3. Yeah, great. Yeah. So, so there are some studies that say you should wait 10 seconds. And 10 seconds feels like a really long time when nobody's answering, particularly on Zoom, I have to say. It's one thing if you can look at your students and you know, kind of goad them into answering, you know, someone will eventually, but on Zoom, it's so much harder. Most teachers wait less than 3 seconds after asking a question before they either supply the answer or call on somebody. And for many teachers, that time is less than 1 second. We are a culture that doesn't like silence. And so we tend to want to provide answers. But what they found is when they coach teachers to wait 5 seconds or longer, that increased the length, number, and quality of student responses. So that wait time is actually quite important. So, you know, I read a study that said 10 seconds. 10 seconds does feel really long, although I do try to wait 10. But if you can wait at least 5, then there are a couple of really important things that will happen. Oh, sorry, this was true across all grade levels and all subjects. So the reason it's important to wait is the singers or students will go through what's called covert retrieval practice. So when you first ask a question, some students will raise their hand immediately. Okay, here's our student who is really, really eager and raising their hand immediately, right? But other people, if you call on that student right away, then other people will stop rehearsing the information. They'll stop trying to recall the information from their memories. So they won't be learning because it'll be over. So some people will take longer to retrieve answers from their memory than this cat who clearly knows the answer. Now I have another slide that shows a photograph of this class that the cat is in from a different angle, and you'll see what's happening here. Okay, so here we have our cat. I realize he changed breeds, but pretend the cat did not change breeds. Okay, who knows the answer? But if you wait, the dog and the cat over here might be having a task-centered discussion and be learning and recalling information. So if you wait your 5 seconds, they might figure out the answer. You can't really see it. There's little mouse ears. Do you see the little mouse ears down there? There's a mouse in this one. And so if you can wait those 5 seconds, not only will the person who answers the question learn, but the people who didn't answer the question will also learn because they will have retrieved things and had time to think. So it benefits more students if you can wait those 5 seconds. So, and another technique is what we call provisions for follow-up. This is another Socratic technique where you ask questions. And this means that before you even, I'll use conducting and rehearsal as an example. Before you even start rehearsing, you ask some questions. And so, for example, what challenge did we conquer at the last rehearsal on this page? Or, you know, what did you fix in your private practice session between rehearsals that will advance this piece today? I always like that question as well. Before we sing this passage, can you tell me 2 things that you want to be thinking about? So what this does is it saves you from nagging after the fact, right? So often what we do is we sing the piece, we haven't sung it for 5 days, and they forget about the dynamics, and we say, oh, you forgot about the dynamics, let's do it again. But with provisions for follow-up, if you ask a couple of quick questions and they bring it back into their head, like, oh yeah, we figured out the dynamics on this page, then you can start and the dynamics will be there because they will have already rehearsed that information. So this is, again, a really efficient way to trigger recall and engagement. And this is particularly true, I think, for choirs that meet only once a week because there is longer between sessions, and so they need to retrieve from a little farther down in the pile. And so this can be really handy. Students retain more learned material when the teacher creates provisions for follow-up. So when you use this technique, they're more likely to remember. It's just a quick and efficient way to trigger recall. And you're priming singers to recall past learning with this really quick prompt. The more times we recall information from our memory, the more we strengthen that neural pathway and the easier we make it to recall the information later. So if you recall it before you sing it, it's going to be even better. We remember what we think about. There we go, back to that. And it's much better than nagging after the fact. So, okay, so those are our strategies for problem solving. And I'm going to, this scares me to stop sharing, but I'm going to stop sharing for a moment and ask if there are any questions about anything in that problem solving section before we move on to accountability. And now I have to wait 10 seconds because I talked about it, or at least 5. We can all sing the Jeopardy theme. If not, I will move on.
I want to mention that there are many more than that in the book.
Oh, thank you, Marcelin. So nice to see you. Yes, I do go through a lot. So I'm just highlighting a few things here, but absolutely, if you if you feel inclined to buy the book, then there will be a lot more in there. So absolutely. Okay, so now I'm going to share again and hope it comes back up with, oh, it did it again. All right, hang on, this will take me just a second. All right, now I can share it. All right. Great, so we're going to talk a little bit about accountability versus social loafing, and we're going to start, believe it or not, by talking about a French agricultural engineer, and his name was Maximilian Ringelmann, and you might wonder what in heaven's name could this have to do with choral music, but believe it or not, it's going to tie in. So what Ringelmann wanted to find out right around the turn of the 20th century was how many horses, oxen, or men could you have on a team before you had diminishing returns in effort, right? So how many could you add to a team before you had diminishing returns in effort? And he did a rope pulling exercise. This is actually not so accurate because he had people pulling on the rope and it was attached to a mechanism so he could measure their effort, which was pretty amazing for the beginning of the 20th century. And this was one of the earliest studies in social psychology. And social psychology is not anything I was ever trained in or even told about in all of my years, ridiculous amount of years of school. But I think social psychology, which talks about group dynamics, is incredibly relevant to what we do as conductors. So I found it really interesting. So Ringelmann discovered an inverse relationship between the number of members of a team and each team member's individual effort. And so while the collective effort went up, which you would expect as you added members to the team, individual effort went down as you added members to the team. And maybe you can see where I'm going to go with this as we are working with a choir. Even after adding only one person to the team, the first person no longer gave 100%, even though they thought they were. So it's not that people are purposely trying to give less, they just instinctively give less because there are so many people on the team. And this is a chart that shows you with one person you have 100%, and as you add, it just declines and declines and declines. So I use Ringelmann as what I call, completely unscientifically, the choral Ringelmann effect. And here is what I think is the choral Ringelmann effect. If you have one soprano, there she is, singing alone, she is going to be thinking about her breathing, her diction, the dynamics, her phrasing, and all of that. But when you add 14 more sopranos to her, and they're going to sing all the same part, she will go through the choral Ringelmann effect, meaning that for each member you add to the team, instinctively, our singers are going to give slightly less than full effort. And so I think it's really important for us to think about how can we counteract this Ringelmann effect. I'm using these terms interchangeably. Ringelmann effect, sometimes known in psychology as diffusion of responsibility, which we see used in terms where you get a lot of people, I think often of, sorry, forgive me, college men in big groups with a lot of beer. And if you asked any of them as individuals, do you think it's a good idea to light this car on fire and turn it over? There's probably no individual in that group that would say, yeah, that's a great idea. But you put them in a group and you have diffusion of responsibility. No one person feels responsible for the group's actions. And sometimes this is also called social loafing, which is mostly what I will call it here. So there's a study that I think is extremely relevant to conductors. This changed my world when I read this study, and it was a study on shouting. So here's what the study was. They took college men and they asked them to shout as loud as they could for 5 seconds. And they did this on various trials, right? And the researchers told the college men that they were studying sensory feedback. And so forgive me for all of you that have degrees in music education, but you should rarely believe what a researcher tells you when they say what they are studying, because they often aren't really studying what they say they are studying. So in this case, they said, we're studying sensory feedback, so we're going to give you a blindfold, we're going to put headphones on you. And so when you're shouting, you won't be able to hear what's going on, but we just are telling you, shout as loud as you can for 5 seconds. And they did the 2 experiments. Here's the first experiment. Shout for 5 seconds. Sometimes they say you're shouting alone. Sometimes they told the college person you are now shouting with 1 other person. And sometimes they said you were shouting with 5 other people. And because they had blindfolds and headphones on, they couldn't really tell what was happening, right? And they were told, well, this is about sensory feedback, so that's the way it's going to be. And they also told these college men that in this first experiment, we can only measure your individual effort shouting when you are shouting alone. So when you're shouting with one other person or 5 other people, we don't have the technology to measure you and what your effort is. We can only measure the collective effort. But when you're shouting alone, we do know how loud you are shouting, right? And this was untrue. And so in fact, researchers could always measure each subject's individual effort, whether they were alone or shouting with others. Sometimes there really were multiple subjects. So sometimes when they said you're shouting with 5 other people, they really were. Sometimes they were in pseudo groups, meaning they were actually shouting alone, even when they had been told they were shouting with 5 other people. And the results from this study confirmed Ringelmann's findings. Subjects exerted less effort when they believed themselves to be shouting with others, whether they really were or not. And they put forth full effort when they believed themselves to be shouting alone. And so they've repeatedly demonstrated, there's been lots of other studies that have demonstrated that participating in a group effort can inspire demotivation. I do talk in the book about some ways in which it can motivate, actually. There are some ways in which it does motivate. For example, when you feel good at a skill, if others are watching you do that skill, you will do better with the skill. They've done a lot of experiments with swimmers. So if you are a great swimmer and people are watching you at a swim meet, you could even swim your very best because you're being watched. And that is true not only for humans, that is also true for cockroaches. Will go through a maze faster if other cockroaches are watching them. Chickens will eat more feed if other chickens are watching them. And rats will have more sex if other rats are watching them. There you go. I would love to meet these people that do this research. So this is frightening because much of our job as conductors is to motivate groups of people, right? And so we just learned that that it can be demotivating and is often demotivating when you're in a group because of social loafing. So then what can we do? Well, the answer is in the second experiment. So they did another shouting study. And researchers placed microphones on each college student and they said, hey, now we have the ability to measure your individual effort when you shout, even in the group. So now we always will know exactly what you as an individual are doing. And this changed everything. So when subjects believed that their individual effort was identifiable, social loafing was completely eliminated and they gave 100% every time. So excuse me, how do we ensure that our singers never feel anonymous in our ensembles? Because clearly we can't exactly put microphones on everybody, although I have heard of people doing assessments where they sing into their phone, right? And so you can hear what each is doing, or sorry, oh gosh. Kathy, you've done the assessment with there's some software, right? Or an app.
Using the phones, yes.
Using the phones, yeah. Sorry, I'm gonna take a quick drink of water. Talk amongst yourselves. Thank you. So how do we ensure that our ensembles so nobody ever feels anonymous? How do we keep our singers accountable without instilling fear? And at this point, I always, every year with my grad students, I always ask this question: is fear a good motivator? And you're all recounting the time that you were either too terrified to really have the assessment work, or excuse me, where a teacher frightened you. Right? I think a lot of people have had that experience. And really, the question needs to be reframed, because extreme stress, the brain can't learn. And this is relevant to anyone that works with children who come from at-risk communities, where if they have to walk through a dangerous neighborhood and they get to your school, they can't learn yet because their brain is still in this extreme stress state. So they need to relax before they can do any learning. So in fact, when you're extremely afraid, neurotransmitters in your brain will block the uptake of new information and new learning during extremely negative stress. And I'll give you an example with apologies for anybody, anyone who is an arachnophobe. Here I will stop sharing for a moment while I tell this. So here's an example of how fear, even when you think it's not a great deal of fear, can interrupt learning. So I've been very fortunate to spend a lot of time in London, and I teach a class each year for the University of Oregon in London. And so when my son was 16, I took him to the London Zoo, which is a lovely zoo. And at the London Zoo, you have all these walkthrough exhibits. You can walk through and get close to lemurs and get close to monkeys and butterflies. And they also had a spider walkthrough. So I am not someone who loves spiders, and that's a great understatement. But I wanted to show my 16-year-old son that there's no reason to be anxious. I could conquer my fear, and I could walk through the spider walkthrough with him. So we entered this room, and there were, giant spiders hanging over your head and to your side on webs, very exotic looking. They were beautiful spiders, but they were everywhere. And you walk through this kind of narrow path. And I walked all the way through, and the guide told us all these interesting facts about the spiders. About halfway through, a woman behind me ducked down to be as short as she could and ran out of the exhibit. So at least I made it through the exhibit. And actually, some weeks later, someone sued the London Zoo because they said they were bitten by a spider in that exhibit. So I had a right to be afraid. But in any case, they told us lots of things about the spiders there. And I listened attentively, and I walked through. It took about 15 minutes. And after we got out, I turned to my son, and I could not remember a single fact that this guide had shared. And the one fact I thought I had learned, I said to my son, and he said, "Mom, you've got that all wrong. That wasn't it at all." And so it was a really good lesson for me on just that feeling of fear and how you cannot learn when you're deeply afraid. But there is another side to this, and I will now share my screen. So highly stressful, for example, individual assessments will not encourage strong or accurate recall of learning. But there is a thing called eustress, which is a moderate state of stress or emotion. And it's kind of like being extra aware, but not overwhelmed, right? A heightened sense of awareness, but not feeling overwhelmed. And that can be, feeling challenged, but not overwhelmed. And that can be actually a really good state for learning. And so when we do assessments, we want to try to figure out ways to do our assessments so that our students get in this state, in eustress, or relaxed, but assessments by nature make people a little bit nervous. And the problem is one-on-a-part singing. Some of my students love one-on-a-part singing. They would completely consider it eustress, right? It's challenging, but not overwhelming. But some of my students would describe it as a high stress situation, right? So finding an assessment where it's not, where you find that middle ground is really important. So I'm just going to give two examples of things I've experimented with that have worked for me. One is I call pass the baton. And I have my students stand in small circles based on their voice part. And then I ask one quartet or an octet to begin singing. Sometimes I'll ask for volunteers, so that's very low stress, people that don't mind singing by themselves. And then they have to tap each other, or sometimes they like to have a pencil and literally pass the baton to the next singer that should be singing. But the first singer must sing with the tagged singer for a bar or two. So it eases the transition, which makes it really nice. It's very comfortable. So you sing together a little bit, and then that first singer will stop, and the second singer continues. And what's nice about this is every singer has to audiate because they don't know when they'll get tagged. And so they're rehearsing and thinking in their head the whole time, and just singing out loud when they're tagged and audiating when they have not been tagged. When I first created this, I was a little worried that some singers would try to trip up other singers, like if they thought, well, Mary never gets the F sharp on page 3, right? So I'm going to make sure and tag Mary on page 3. But I've never seen that happen. I've seen the students are only generous with each other on this exercise. So I've had good luck with this, and they laugh and it's fun, but you also hear what you need to hear in an assessment. So I've liked that one. And another one I've had good luck with is what I call a whiteout test. And I do this after the music is memorized. And I put the singers in pairs, usually who do not sing the same voice part. So I might put a soprano and bass together. And I hand them a page from the score with all of the markings whited out. And so they can't see articulation, dynamics, nothing. And then they have to work together to put back in the markings. So dynamics, articulation, tempo, etc. What I like about this exercise, the reason I put them in pairs, the first time I did the exercise, I just did it as individuals. And they didn't like the exercise very much at all. So I experimented another time. I waited like a year and experimented another time and put them in pairs. This they loved because they got all these discussions going about, wait, did he mark mezzo piano or did the composer not mark it, but we feel that should be mezzo piano there? And they had all these great discussions about how much was the composer on the paper and how much was what we lifted off the paper. And so I really, really like doing these kinds of tests. And my students like it now that it's in pairs. They didn't like it so much when they were all by themselves. I like pairing them up like on buses when you're on tour to do score study in pairs then as well. I think that works really well. Then once, sorry, I should finish the exercise. Once they've finished it, they go back and look at their music and they can see, what they got right and what they might have forgotten. But what it does is it rehearses the information in their head. And so when they come back to singing it, they have it's much more refreshed in their head. So I found it really a good exercise for them. Okay, now I'm going to stop sharing my screen and talk a little bit about emotion. And I'm going to take you through an exercise that I just did with my students. So any of us can say anecdotally that moment in rehearsal where we've told just the right story or we've keyed into exactly the right emotion and you know that your students are really listening to you. Or I guess some of you are probably voice teachers rather than choral conductors, and you just know that moment where your student has connected emotionally with a piece. And studies do show, there's a lovely book by Sarah Cavanaugh I think it's called The Spark of Learning. And the whole book is about emotion and how emotion is tied to learning. It was a really fascinating read for me. I'm kind of nerdy about that stuff. So we do know that science supports emotion as a motivator and emotion as helping with memory and emotion also helping with attention and focus. And we know the same thing about humor. And so I wanted to get information from my students about how they felt about starting school. So we're on our fourth week. We just started our fourth week of the term because we're on the quarter system. So on the very first day that I met with my chamber choir, I said, I'm going to show you a slide, and the slide has 5 pictures on it. And I want you to pick the picture that best expresses how you feel about starting school right now. So I'm going to ask you all to do the same thing, and then anyone that feels brave enough could volunteer which of the pictures they picked. And I don't know that starting school is relevant to your situation, so you could sort of figure out what situation it might be. So I don't know what that could be, starting a new rehearsal or working with a new student or however you want to think of it, or maybe go back to when you were starting school and how did you feel. So I'm going to show you these pictures and then you can pick one and then I will stop sharing as soon as we've done that. Okay, so whoops. First, a quick review. And now here we go. Here is our picture. So which of those best expressed whatever your situations? For my students, it was which of these best expresses your feelings about starting school? And when I did this with my students, I asked them to type in the chat. Then I put them in breakout rooms and had them talk a little bit about it. Because I feel like part of our job as educators is to help our students work through what's happening with the pandemic and the challenges that they're going through right now. And it's tough I think it would be a very difficult time to be a student. And so I wanted to be able to talk about it, but I wanted to inject a little bit of humor in that as well. So this is how I did that. Okay, so anybody courageous enough to tell us which they are sharing and what the circumstance was?
I can share mine.
Great, thank you.
I'm going to pick 2 pictures. First day of the chorale season launch, I'm the hedgehog, kind of comfortably ready to go, happy but not, SpongeBob. I'm right there. I'm ready to go. But then that also lined up with distance learning my children while working from home in all of this business. And then I'm definitely the Grim Reaper up in the corner.
Great. Good. Anybody else? I will tell you what my students shared. So I had two different people, I had more than two, but I had really two different views on the balloons, right? You had the colorful balloons, which I thought was an optimistic kind of thing. And I did have people choose it saying it was optimistic and colorful and they were excited to be back. I had one student choose the balloons who said he chose them because they were fragile and easily broken. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this exercise was to look out for any student that gave an answer exactly like that. So I could just keep an eye on this. This was a freshman. This was his very first time there. And so that worried me a bit. So so I was glad to know about that. Yeah. I had students choose the Grim Reaper, not very many, but one of them thought the Grim Reaper looked really hot and powerful. And that's why she chose the Grim Reaper. And then I only had a few choose the hedgehog. Most of them, the vast majority chose the kitty in the trash can, who they called Trash Kitty. They thought just peering out from the trash can was what they felt like. And I had only one person choose SpongeBob. I was so disappointed. I thought a lot of people would choose SpongeBob. And he said he chose him because his eyes look wild. So that's why he chose him. Okay. But in any case, I could have, I have to get back to my right screen. I could have just asked, how are you feeling about starting school, right? But doing this using visual cortex, which visual is very strong. We had to remember things through seeing long before language was created. So it's a very good way, a good input for the brain. And also with a little bit of humor and the pictures. And so it actually worked really very well for what I was looking for. Right, and now I will try to share my screen again. All right. So next, still under accountability, is the power of priming. This I'll go through pretty quickly. Priming is the idea that by setting up someone's experience in a certain way, can people be made more receptive to certain ideas or to moods? And can people's productivity be improved? And while this sounds like it could be a little nefarious, it actually has some really lovely applications for us as teachers. And so there have been studies that have shown that, and this is really simple, that greeting students in a positive manner as they enter your classroom has a very positive effect on their work. And they did this with high school students, middle school students, and also college students, that college students actually scored better on tests when they were greeted. And often greeted by name or greeted with a positive statement, that this can actually be very powerful, and it's such a simple thing to do. This is what we call an antecedent intervention, which is when you, before you have any problems, you take action. And I think that's such a lovely thought. I first read about this in Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blink, The Power of Thinking Without Thinking. And I know sometimes these social psychology studies can be a little controversial. And I'm going to describe one that is rather controversial, but I still do think there's something to be said about these. So the one I'm going to describe to you, which I think can be relevant to conductors, is by a researcher at NYU. And he did some research asking students to come in and simply unscramble some sentences. And so that's what they thought the research was about how quickly they might unscramble sentences. But in fact, he gave out two different papers of sentences. One group of students saw polite words in the scrambled sentences, like patiently, courteous, considerate, yield. And the other group saw rude words, like aggressively, bother, disturb, intrude, infringe. And there weren't so many of these specific words in the sentence scrambles that the students would have realized what was happening. So, because once they realized what was happening, then he wouldn't be able to explore what he wanted to explore, right? So half of the students saw polite words in their scrambled sentence, half of them saw rude words. And then the test took about 5 minutes. It was very short. And at the end of the test, the subjects were to walk down a hall and hand their paper to a professor. And the professor was what we call a confederate, which means the professor was in on the study. So the professor purposefully was in a conversation with another person. And so the question was, would the people who saw the polite words wait longer than the people who saw the rude words, right? So that's what he was trying to figure out. And when he designed the study, because when you do studies with real life people, you have to sign all these things, the NYU people said, don't let them wait longer than 10 minutes. If anyone waits 10 minutes, then stop the experiment and say, oh, thank you, and explain the experiment. And at the time, this researcher said, nobody's going to wait 10 minutes, right? They just need to stand there and hand in their paper. So here were the results. Subjects primed with the rude words interrupted on average after 5 minutes. So about 5 minutes, they interrupted, they handed in their paper. 82% of the subjects primed with polite words never interrupted. And the only problem, this is social psychology, and so some researchers have found this difficult to replicate, which again is the hallmark of good research, but some people have replicated it. And so this study is a little bit controversial for that reason. But I have to say, I'm still a big believer in priming, in priming our singers. Whoops, and I don't want that. In priming our singers. And actually, Kathy and I have talked about this when I described a horrible travel experience that my students had, where they had to get, we were traveling from Portland, Oregon to Spain, and we had, actually I have it written down so I remember, it was 19 hours in the airport because it was delayed. Then they took a red eye, then they had 11 hours in another airport, 12 hours in another airport. And then they finally got to Spain the morning of our sound check, right? So they arrived just exactly in time to make the sound check on the day that we had our concert. And I had primed them a whole lot to just be ready for anything in traveling. And we talked a lot about it as the ensemble and about being kind to each other. And they really did an amazing job. And Kathy has talked about how she talks about flexible and cheerful. Is that what it is, Kathy?
That's it. Yeah, cheerful and flexible.
Cheerful and flexible. And I really do believe this, that, you know, the conductor that walks into rehearsal, you know, a minute before rehearsal starts complaining about how their dean is terrible, and, you know, they're priming their students for a certain experience. And the person that is able to arrive 10 minutes early and greet people at the door and be excited about rehearsal, I believe is priming them for a different experience. So I do think this priming is something that we should pay attention to and think about. We all want to be cheerful in our rehearsal, but it's just easy to get caught up with that last email or that last phone call, or you have a fight with your spouse right before you walk out the door, or whatever it is, you know. And so just a good reminder to us about priming. Okay, and then, and now I'll review. Here we are, learned helplessness. So this is the last one in our category of accountability. And, you know, so much of what we say to our students is bad news, right? So, or corrections, right? So we say, sopranos, you're flat. And, you know, George, you forgot your music again. And all of those kinds of things. And we have to be really mindful not to create a situation of learned helplessness. And so in educational settings, learned helplessness means somebody perceives themselves as failed at the task. And when they perceive that they are failing at the task, they no longer give their full effort. And that is learned helplessness in an educational setting. And I'm saying that carefully because there were some horrible experiments that involve shocking dogs, which also is a different, I mean, it has to do with learned helplessness, but I'm not talking about those. So I'm talking about in an educational setting, it's easy for us to create a situation where students feel like they have failed somehow. And then they stop trying. And I'm going to give you an example that is not have to do with music, and then I'll give you an example that has to do with music. So this is an example. This is a real professor back east who told her students that they were going to study what it's like when teenagers don't feel like they belong to the social group. And again, this was not really what they were studying. And she handed out a page to everybody. She handed out a test to everyone. She said, so to demonstrate this, I'm going to give you all this test, and this test has to do with just solving anagrams. So, you know, here's a test. It has a few easy anagrams on it. So here you go. She handed out the test. But in fact, what she did was she handed out two tests. One test had 3 easy anagrams. So the one on the left like pat. And if you saw that, it is an anagram, you would redo it and you'd say tap. I can make another word out of pat. But the other half of the class got their first anagram was an impossible anagram. And I should never put this on a slide, because now you're all going to spend the next 30 minutes trying to figure out if you can make another word from the 5 letters in whirl. But let me assure you that you can't. So whirl is an impossible anagram, apparently. And so she hands out the pages. They all think they have the same 3 easy anagrams. And she says, raise your hand when you have solved the first anagram. And about half the class raised their hand because they had pat. They turned it into tap. They're good. The other half's kind of looking around going, gosh, I didn't get that. Wow. And she said, that's all right. Move on to the second anagram. No problem. So they move on to the second anagram. Second anagram, the people that had pat have another easy anagram. The people who got whirl have another impossible anagram. So once again, raise your hands when you're done with the second one. Half the class goes up very quickly. Half the class is still looking around going, oh my gosh, I'm not good at anagrams. I thought I could do this, but I am a failed anagram solver. The third anagram, both papers have the same easy to solve anagram. And yet the people in this group who had 2 impossible anagrams, who consider themselves not good anagram solvers, a high percentage of them could not solve the third anagram, even though it was easy, because of learned helplessness. They perceive themselves to be failed anagram solvers. And the example that I have that as conductors that I've seen happen, that we all do, I'm using an example of something I saw, but certainly I know I have done it as well. A conductor doing an honor choir, and it was the last hour before they went out on stage for the honor choir. And he said, let's just do a quick sound check. And so they started singing, and he stopped them after the second bar and said, oh, that chord of the second bar is really out of tune. Let's do that again. And they went back to the first bar and got to the second bar, and he said, oh, it's still really out of tune. Let's just take that apart. And this was an hour before a full concert, and he would not let them get past the second bar. And you could just feel the energy in the room just shrinking. I mean, we've all done that at some point. We've all felt the death spiral, or we've all been responsible for a death spiral in rehearsal, where we just feel that something is going wrong. But he didn't realize it was his own way of working that was doing it. But the singers considered themselves failed by that second bar, and they stopped giving their all. And it was really unfortunate. It was very, very hard to watch. So, all right, I'm gonna move on. Are there any questions about any of that I can answer? Now we'll go to our last few categories. So I'm going to talk about multiple entry points for information. And now this is the most controversial thing I will say this evening. Many of us are taught about learning styles, visual, auditory, kinesthetic. And the fundamental premise that most of us are taught is that if you match the mode of teaching to the student's dominant style of learning, the student will be more successful. And here's the controversial part. Excuse me. Well-designed studies consistently demonstrate that students are no more successful at learning when taught in their preferred learning style than when they are taught by other means. Science does not yet, and I put yet because maybe science just hasn't developed the way to research this yet, but science does not yet support the commonly held belief that students will learn best if you teach to their preferred learning modality. But what science has proven is this, that practicing using different methods of engagement may help promote attention and better performance. So it's very similar to the learning styles, but it's a little bit different. It has to do with how information is received. So researchers believe the more entry points for information, the more solidly interwoven, sorry, I'm going to admit Tim went to Westerhouse. We can all say hello to Tim. Researchers believe the more entry points for information, the more solidly interwoven material will be neurologically, and the more triggers will be available for recall. And I'll give some examples of this. So the first example is not musical. This is one I read about that I absolutely love. This is a grammar lesson for second graders, right? And you can imagine trying to give a lesson about, a lecture about grammar to second graders to try to teach them. So instead, this teacher had them hold their books and walk around the room. And when they got to a comma, they had to pause. When they got to a period, they had to stop. When they got to a question mark, they had to shrug their shoulders. And when they got to an exclamation point, they had to jump. So this is brilliant because it's tactile, right? You're holding the book, so you're feeling it. It's auditory, you're hearing the reading. It's visual, you see your classmates move. It's kinesthetic, you're moving yourself. So walking the punctuation creates all these opportunities for these varied neural pathways, which will be really helpful later on. Triggering. Recall. So I'll give you two examples that I've had some good luck with this. This is an exercise I stole from a band director, and it's a pencil tap exercise. So I asked the singers to stand all around the room, holding their pencils in their hands, and then I have them tap the rhythms with dynamics and phrase shapes to their own part. Usually I don't have them sing, I just have them tap dynamics and phrase shapes in their part with the rhythms. So it has lots of entry points for information. It's auditory, they hear the tapping. It's visual, they see people tapping. It's tactile, they're holding a pencil and feeling taps. And it's kinesthetic, which is the motion of tapping. And I find this exercise when I'm doing something like a Sidney Guillaume piece that has lots of fast rhythms to it, this cleans things up really quickly. And I'm really convinced it's because there's so many entry points for this information, and that it really helps people learn quickly. So I've had very good luck with that exercise. Other quick ideas about this, I love people when they have you tap the cutoff. I think anytime you can feel the music in your hands, I think is great. Playing a passage on your sternum is so useful. So again, it's physical, tapping tactus on a neighbor's shoulder. So you're seeing it, you're feeling it, you might be hearing it. So it gives multiple entry points. And one other that I've had good luck with is textural analysis, foreground and background. So I had put the singers in a circle, and if they feel their part should be foreground, I ask them to step into the center of the circle and sing louder. And if they should be background, to please step back and sing softer. This is fun because they don't always agree. So sometimes there's a lot of peer pressure that goes on. But I find singers are really instinctive when you do this with a fugal section, or I love doing this with a Sean Kirshner arrangement because he always has such thick textures. And this helps them see, oh yeah, I'm background now. I don't need to sing this part that loud. I've had great luck with this. And again, it's physical. Yeah, great opportunities to discuss if they don't agree, but it also gives you all that, tactile, auditory, visual, all of that. And so if you can combine as many entry points for information as possible, the learning is going to be more interwoven neurologically, and it is a great technique for learning. So sorry, I'm moving quickly to be sure I get through it with everything in our time. So I'm going to talk a little bit about writing and rehearsal, and I'll leave time at the end for any questions. So writing and rehearsal may seem unusual, but any activity where students need to organize their thinking or reflect on their knowledge is really good for memory and learning. So I actually love using writing. Writing doesn't need to take a lot of time. We can do these little 5-minute writes. Here are a couple of ways that I've used it. I'm going to highlight 2 ways you can use writing. One is I do a sick bay writing opportunity. So if a student has to sit out because their chords are rough and they can't sing on their chords, or if they're contagious, I have them sit out and I hand them a piece of paper and they have to answer just 3 questions. Because I found that otherwise they tend to become kind of disengaged. They already don't feel well and they're sitting out and they're not really participating. So here are the 3 questions I ask. What was the most important thing that happened in rehearsal today? What did you hear sitting out of rehearsal that you would not have heard had you been in it? And how did your section do today? And this has been wonderful. I get such lovely answers. And I was a little worried when I started this that I would get very short answers because people already don't feel well and they don't want to write, but that almost never happens. Instead, people say they love sitting out and listening from the outside. It's made me wonder if I should always pull a few students out to stand in front and listen because they do hear differently. And so I've had really good luck with this at keeping the people that are sitting out to stay engaged. Then I also use short writes. So as a students enter a room, I love to give them a little half sheet of colored paper. And this creates eustress, right? They're challenged because they know there's going to be some kind of a question that they have to answer, but they're not overwhelmed because I never make them, really scary. I'll go back and do that in just a second. Oops, there we go. So never underestimate the power of handing a student a half sheet of paper when they walk in the room, because they will now think, rats, what was I supposed to know for today? Was I supposed to know the translation? Was I supposed to have analyzed this or this? So there's tons of task-centered discussions that go on from the time you hand them the paper until the time rehearsal starts. And so a whole lot of information gets rehearsed, which is really what the goal is in any case. So I love handing people a piece of paper. And usually I use the different colors just because it provokes interesting conversations. You know, can I have that one? That's my favorite color. Or, oh, I got pink last time. Great. And now I have orange. So it just is a way to just talk and chat a little bit with your students. But here's an important thing, and that has to do with selecting teams. I used to select teams by just letting the students do it. So I would say to the class, okay, break yourself into 5 groups or 6 groups. And then I forget now, to be honest, if I read this or if I heard someone speaking about it. That's terrible. I should remember how I learned this. I think I heard someone speaking about it. And they said, when you do that, it puts anyone in the room who is different from the majority in a really awkward situation where they could be excluded. So if you have anybody with special needs or ethnic that's different from the majority in terms of ethnicity or gender, then this can be a time for stress when people break into their teams. So I now always use the paper color for teams. So I'll say orange group, you're over here, yellow group, you're over here. And that removes that stress for many students who might feel like that is a stressful situation. Or obviously you can talk to your students about being inclusive and making sure that you are completely inclusive. But I thought I would just mention that because I thought it was a really good point. So ways I use writing. You could do a quick predictive write at the opening of rehearsal. You could do a mid-rehearsal write to change up activities, or you could do an exit card write at the end of rehearsal, and that's kind of their exit ticket that they give it to you when they leave rehearsal. So there are lots of different ways that you could use short writes. The studies have shown that when students predict how their learning is going to go, that they actually learn a little more. They learn a little better. So I think predictive writes, which I have to say I haven't used a lot, but I'm really intrigued by that study. I wanted to explain the difference between elaborative rehearsal and rote rehearsal here, because rote rehearsal is like when you remember a phone number and someone gives it to you, and before you can type it into your phone, you recite it in exactly the same form that it came to you, right? And that's rote rehearsal. Elaborative rehearsal is when, in rehearsing information, it becomes more meaningful to you, or it becomes more relevant to you. And when that happens, you are much more likely to remember it. And so elaborative rehearsal, they also know from doing PET scans that more areas of the brain light up when you do elaborative rehearsal versus rote rehearsal. So as much as we can, we want to be sure that our students are using elaborative rehearsal. So here's some examples of short writes that are possible. What piece will we make the most progress on today and why? Would be an interesting question. How will your personal musical contribution make a positive impact? You can tell I ask a lot of questions about, did you practice? But not exactly that way. What was your favorite part of rehearsal today? This can be incredibly informative to me. You know, what my favorite part of rehearsal is often not what their favorite part of rehearsal was. So I actually really enjoy those answers. If you could change one thing about today's rehearsal, what would it be? You have to be willing to take the feedback, but it can be really useful feedback, you know, for them to say, well, honestly, the way you spoke to Lisa made me uncomfortable, or whatever their feedback might be. What would you like me to know about you? Great right to do early in the term. Obviously, you're not going to do all these at one time, so I'm just giving you lots of ideas. I really like this one. Change the end of the story in one of our songs and describe the impact on the characters or plot line involved. Might this change the musical expression? So it's just like giving them another vision of their music. It's like Dead Poets Society when Robin Williams stands on the desk to recite poetry and has his students stand on the desks to recite poetry. So it's a different way of looking at it. What pop song might be a good pairing with our Latvian song? I've used this, and it means I get to listen to what my students are listening to, what pop music they're listening to, which occasionally is scary, but mostly is really interesting to hear what they are interested in. And they've done some really interesting pairings. If you were to synthesize the meaning of the psalm text set by Schutz into a tweet, what would you write? Right. So if you have to put it in a tweet, you're going to make it condensed, you're going to have to understand it, and you're going to have to make it kind of more relevant, right, to your life because you're tweeting. So that again is another really good way to get students to just think in a different way. And here we are at Joy. let me just stop sharing for a moment before I talk about joy, which doesn't have another slide, so I can tell you everything I think I need to tell you about joy without sharing. So any questions to this point before we wrap up with joy, and any other questions? Sorry, I am talking fast. I did a similar talk for the Brazilian, it's called the New Brazil Choral Directors Association some weeks ago, which was at 5:15 in the morning, Oregon time. Thank you very much. But the good thing was I had to always stop after every 2 sentences so they could translate it into Portuguese. And that made me talk slower because I knew somebody had to understand me well enough to translate into Portuguese. So it's actually a really good exercise, which clearly taught me nothing because I'm speaking much too quickly now. But if there aren't questions, I will finish. And then if there are any further questions, then we will be able to answer them after that. So as I said, it's my tradition to end any time I present by talking about the joy that we find in music making. And here's the reason. I worry about my students that they came into studying music as a music major because they love music, and then they take all the courses and have all the stress of music theory and history and recitals, and I think it can wring the joy out of music for them for at least a short time, so I worry about them. And also I worry about us as teachers and conductors, that we are asked to deal with so much with fewer and fewer resources, that it's also easy for us to get out of touch with the joy that brought us to this field in the first place, because we all started this with passion. That's why we all got into this. And then added to that is the pandemic. And I think the stressors that the pandemic puts on everybody, just even people that I know that are normally very joyful people, have had a rough go from time to time. So putting all that together, I have a philosophy that in every rehearsal that I run, at some point, it's my commitment to get my singers back in touch with the joy that they first felt. And often that happens naturally, that you just have this joyful moment in a rehearsal. And so I know that that we've had at least one. But sometimes you have to just make sure it happens. Sometimes we just have to make sure that even though it's a hard rehearsal, that at some point our students reconnect with that joy, because I just think it's so important. And it's important for us also that we reconnect with that joy. Years ago, Kathy's heard me tell this story. I had Maria Guinon, the Venezuelan conductor, as a guest at the University of Oregon, and she worked with 2 of my choirs. And we'd had a little less rehearsal time than I had wanted. And all of you know what that is like. I'm sure I'm not the only person on this Zoom that has had less rehearsal time than they had hoped to have to get a program ready. And so Maria did fantastic work with my students that week. And then the morning that I picked her up for the concert, it was an afternoon concert, I wondered, that was the first time I'd ever really got to know her. And I thought, I wonder if she'll be stressed out because we're just a little underprepared, and I hope this goes okay, and I wonder if she'll be worried, and what will this be like? And I picked her up, and she got in the car, and she said words that I will never forget. She said, "Sharon, today is all about joy." And that was it. You know, that to her, music making is about joy, and you put all this work in to make it work, but then whatever happens, happens. It's all about joy. And I absolutely love that. It really did change my vision of how I work. And the last thing is I want to quote from a book called Teach Like Finland. I don't know if anyone has read that book. It has nothing to do with music. It's by Timothy Walker, who he was an elementary school teacher in the US who went to Finland and taught for 2 years in Finland. And one of the things he noticed about the Finnish is that they really think a lot about their students' happiness. They also give them breaks. I think every hour they take a 10 or 15 minute outdoor break. I mean, it's quite astonishing. But they have concerns about their happiness, and they define happiness as a student having a feeling of belonging, autonomy, and mastery. And I loved that definition because it suits choral music so well, right? You know, we are a community of musicians, so there's that feeling of belonging. We hopefully make some autonomous decisions, as we've talked about. So there is some autonomy within our group. Even though we are a group, we also have some autonomy. And hopefully there's mastery, and we produce beautiful music together. And so to me, happiness is choral music. There you go. And that's where I will end. So questions. I see, I even left 12 minutes for questions.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Sharon. I would encourage you to take these last 10 minutes and ask Sharon questions about what you're doing regarding your own activity or her activity.
Speaking of joy, if you have a rehearsal and it feels like it's going downhill, what kinds of things do you do or make sure happen so that you get that joy in that particular rehearsal?
Yeah, that's a great question. So to me, often it's just about changing things up. So we've established a rhythm that is going in the wrong direction. So that is sometimes a great time for a little mid-rehearsal, right? Where you take 5 minutes and say, tell me how we can make this a better rehearsal, or what's happening. So that would work. I do everything to keep people moving. So I might change formation, move them around, have a student stand up to conduct. Just pause. Sometimes naming the elephant in the room is helpful. So sometimes just saying, hey, this isn't quite going the way I pictured it going in my head. So let's regroup for a moment and figure out how we can make this work better. And I find we can usually do it. It's usually within our control. It's just sometimes we don't, it takes kind of those extra resources to think and make it happen. So I have an amazing dean who came to us 2 years ago at the university, at the School of Music and Dance. And one of her great gifts in dealing with difficult personnel issues that I'm the department head, so I sit in on some of these difficult discussions. One of the things I've learned from her is that she names the elephant in the room. And so the thing that you're all thinking, oh, please don't say this, no, because we're not going to talk about that. She just puts it out there and is so transparent that it's completely disarming and people are able to talk more openly. And I've just learned a lot from watching her work. So anyway, all right. Thank you, Marceline, for that question. Anybody else? I love all the animals that are showing up, by the way.
Sharon, what are some of your COVID strategies? Because I believe you're meeting with your ensembles online.
We're hybrid, actually. So 2 days a week they're at school and in person, but in small groups, and 2 days a week we're online. So in learning more about teaching online, a couple of things that have been really helpful to me. One is that I find, and I read this pedagogically as well, you have to change activities more often than you would in a normal classroom. So normally, I could rehearse and really have one teaching episode be, 20 minutes or 25 minutes. And I think with teaching online, that has to be changed up. And so I do use breakout rooms a lot. I use polls. I will use the chat. I will change activities fairly frequently. I'll have them unmute or sing muted or do some scales where some are unmuted, some are muted. So I do more icebreakers than I have in the past because I want them to feel like a community. And so I've stolen icebreakers from everyone I could find. Angie, I've stolen some from you, I think. There was some post, I think, in Washington, ACDA. So I steal from everywhere. And the icebreakers have been great, actually. That's been so helpful to my students, and just even getting conversations started and being able to talk on Zoom. So yeah, so those are some of the things I've been experimenting with. Anything else?
I'm Shannon. I just have a comment.
Yeah.
And I just really, really appreciate the knowledge that you're putting forth and you've brought forth in this book. I'm listening to you and I'm watching you and I'm hearing all of these things, and I think, well, do I do that in my classroom? Yeah, I do things that are very similar. I do a version of it. And it was just like, I'm reading your slides. I'm like, well, there's everything. If somebody asks me, what do you do for a living? Well, I teach choir and rock band and I sing with Minnesota Choral. Yeah. And then it's like, but then if they say, well, give me more details. And it's like, well, I don't know. I just do what I do. And I just really appreciate seeing what I do in print and then adding so many other ideas. on top of that, and it just really got my mind moving. And I also appreciated you bringing the content of joy to the end of a rehearsal. I teach in Minneapolis, and the area I teach in has been hit really hard. And I have students who are super scared. And so, yeah, they're not learning like I think I want them to learn, but you adapt, and sometimes they leave and you can just feel that they're sad. And so I really appreciated that you are really pressing to connect that joy, bring back in with the music. That I really needed to hear that today. So thank you so very much for being with us.
Thank you for the feedback. Thank you. I really do feel like we teach humans through music, right? And that's what we're teaching critical thinking. We're teaching so much more than music. And Kathy has heard me say this. One time someone asked my mother if she wasn't embarrassed that all her daughter did for a living was wave her arms in front of people. and my mother was a very strong-willed New Yorker, and she gave her a piece of her mind. So she explained what I did for a living. Anyway. So anything else? Thank you for the feedback. I appreciate it. It's really scary when you write a book and you put it out there, and yeah, it's a scary thing. It's been an interesting process. So I appreciate the feedback. Any other questions I could answer? Any other comments people want to make?
I'll go. Hi, I'm Gloria, and I don't know. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I used to direct a small choir in my synagogue, but that was years ago. And I guess I also incorporated some of your methods without even realizing it. But what I really liked in your presentation was when you talked about the silence and you asked about questions and how long you should wait for an answer. Because I agree that our society is so much in a rush most of the time that we feel like we have to answer right away. And sometimes the silence is not an indication that you don't know. It's an indication that you're being thoughtful about your answer. And so I really appreciated that part of your talk. And it kind of reminds me of something I recently heard about music in general, that a lot of music is about the silence between the notes. And that was a new concept for me, and I think it's very, very important.
That's lovely. Thank you. And I will say I also work with mindfulness with my students. And so I will often start rehearsals with mindfulness exercises. And I've done this with all state choirs too. And it's fascinating, like Nevada. So we had, I think it was 250 students in the all state. It was just a ridiculously huge number. And I would start with mindfulness. And when you do mindfulness exercises, the room gets completely quiet. And high school students are not accustomed to being in a room with 250 people that is completely quiet. And over the course of our days of rehearsing, I could bring them back to mindfulness and then start a rehearsal. And so you're framing your music with silence, which is really very beautiful and a great experience for our singers. So I've become a big believer in mindfulness. I write a little bit about it in the book, and Frank Diaz, who used to teach at the University of Oregon and Indiana University, stole him from us. Oh, by way of UMKC. UMKC stole it first, and then Indiana stole him from UMKC. But he writes a lot and uses mindfulness with orchestras, right? So, which is astonishing, right? I mean, you could figure that singers would do mindfulness because we give back rubs and we do that kind of stuff. But he uses it with orchestras extremely effectively. I mean, it's really a beautiful thing to behold. So,
Sharon, Patrick Romy here. First of all, do you have any particular strategies or specific issues or challenges connected with addressing male singers versus female singers in a mixed choral setting, or in settings where you have just a male chorus or a female, your women's chorus? Are there differences in what you do to try to engage any male or female groups that are different than the things you addressed more generally?
Well, I have to say that right now I only work with an SATB group. I work with mixed choir only. So I don't have a lot of experience working with just a soprano alto choir or a tenor bass choir at this point. I was with the girls chorus, the San Francisco Girls Chorus, for 8 years. So certainly there are certain techniques you would use to engage teenage girls, but that was a different matter. Gosh, and it's been 20 years since I've been there. So I'm not sure I have the best of advice for you on that one, because I really haven't done it much lately. Sorry. Anything else that I can answer or to try to answer?
Well, still staying with that, do you pay different attention to your women singers in your mixed group than your men? Do you see certain tendencies in behaviors or in learning approach of a piece of music that you respond to or address in the course of your engagement?
Interesting. I don't think I do, actually. We tease singers about, what a tenor is like, or, what a soprano is like. But I think overall, in addressing and using these techniques, I feel like I get, good engagement from tenors and basses and sopranos and altos. So I don't feel like it's gender specific, at least not in my experience. So yeah, I don't feel like I've had to change things. I think the only time I change things is when I'm working with different age groups. Then I would adapt these techniques for different age groups and would do them differently than I do with the college students, certainly. But I have not had the experience of having to teach differently based on gender.
And having observed your rehearsals, your students are incredibly engaged and very animated. And I think that they learn over time, the younger students who are entering their first, let's say, quarter, they learn over time that it's a safe place for them to connect with people and explore and grow. And so my observation, having watched your rehearsals over the years, is that there just seems like a sense of freedom between the singers, and they feel empowered to take ownership of their educational experience and to share that with those around them.
Yeah, thanks. And that, if I were to define what my values are, that would be one of my prime values, is that I want to empower my students to work together collaboratively. In fact, I have a mission statement that I read to them at the beginning of the year about working collaboratively and empowering them to think for themselves, right? So that they're not passive, and to make it a safe space. And that's really important. And actually, it's interesting because sometimes you have to have discussions that are difficult, and excuse me, recently discussing, should a choir that's primarily white in Oregon sing spirituals? Those are difficult discussions to have. And it's really important that you're in a safe space where everyone can voice their opinion. And what I've said to my students when we've had those difficult discussions is, this is the university at its best. This is what we should be doing. We should be thinking about challenging issues and talking about them and working things out. And so thank you for saying that, Kathy. I appreciate it. That certainly is a value it's something that I value very much.
Well, we've come to the end of our time. It's just been such a joy to hear you speak about about your methodology, and I know that you put it into practice with such passion and joy, because I've seen the results. So again, I would encourage people to unmute and to share their appreciation with Sharon Paul, and we'll hope that we can have her back at some point, maybe in person, to work with our community. So, Newton, let's give a big applause. So thank you all for making some time in your evenings. Thank you, Sharon and Alyssa, for being our technology host. And we hope we see you again next week at our next interactive session.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Ciao.
Michael, good to see you.
You got this, Shannon.
The room is empty.